We are looking, if you'll throw my title slide up, Casey, we are continuing to look at the scandal in Jerusalem, part 3. And right now it's recap time. What we're looking at in the scandal in Jerusalem is the second tassel miracle. There's 2 tassel miracles in Matthew. It's these miraculous times that surround a tassel on Jesus' garment. And in the first one, we realized that healing in life was not in the law. It wasn't in the old stuff, the stuff that today we might refer to as religion. It wasn't there. Life was in Jesus, who is the life-creating Word of God. But the law, religion, it can point us in the right direction. And we might say that religion can introduce us to Jesus. It might create the handoff, the introduction to the divine, but it can't provide life or healing in and of itself. And so these are the comparisons we've been looking at. In the second tassel miracle, we saw that when we come to the old through Jesus, then you can find all kinds of cool stuff in there. In the law, in religion, we can find life and healing when Jesus is our starting point. And we looked at how that works last week. In Psalm 78, we've seen over past weeks that we find a fearful God who kills people when they struggle with their faith. He sends them mercy, but with death. As the food of his mercy is in their mouth, he kills them. And we can think, this is not the God who Jesus is showing me. Jesus gives a hand up to those who are struggling with their faith and sinking into the waves. And Jesus shows us a God who is faithful even when we're unfaithful. So we can be tempted to toss out the death-dealing God perceived by Moses and sung of in the Psalms, but we considered that this isn't the Old Testament. It's not full of old stuff that's outdated. As one theologian said, with the Spirit, the old is new again. Without the Spirit, the new is old. You need the Spirit with it. And so having met Jesus, we can come to Psalms with new eyes and we can find treasure there. And I realized that God does send death where faith is struggling and lacking. And he sends it alongside his mercy. Because when he sends mercy to me in my struggling, lacking faith, the place where faith is lacking in me dies off. There is a death that accompanies mercy. And the more that I'm touched with divine love and mercy through my life, the more faith grows in me. The little faith, the lacking faith dies. And so the treasure that I pull from Psalm 78 when I come to it through Jesus is that God's mercy does come paired with death. The love of God is a death-dealing love. It deals death to the places in me that shouldn't be there, the places in me that struggle with faith. After looking at the tassel dynamics directly, we looked at the defilement context. There's not an issue of defilement when Jesus comes in contact with the dead and dying. We don't see defilement happen. Then, when it comes to us, Jesus declares that people are not defiled by what they eat. He clarifies that the source of defilement is from within us. It's our heart. Our heart is where defilement takes place. And this scandalizes Jerusalem because Moses had said differently. In one of his speeches in Deuteronomy, he said that food defiles you. And so this creates a high point of the showdown between Jesus and Jerusalem. Jesus is removing God from being planted in Jerusalem, and he is planting God into himself. So now we're on to our third contextual matter with these 2 tassel miracles. And Jesus as the Messiah, as the Son of David, he is the expected Savior. And part of what Matthew is combating in his writings is the Jewish expectation that the Savior was coming to save the Jews against the Gentiles, against other people. Matthew's making the case that Jesus has come to save every human being from themselves, not against others. So the first case in Matthew 9, we see two blind men where the other Gospels have one. These two reflect the two parties who need God's illumination to be saved from themselves. It reflects Jew and Gentile. And as we read on, especially beginning in Matthew 13 with the foundational training of the parables, the Jews have joined with Jesus now. This is most prominently seen in his Jewish apostles. But in case we forgot about the Gentiles, Jesus is now going into Gentile territory on the heels of his conflict with Jerusalem. What we see through Matthew is, as there's a rejection from over here, Jesus is going over there into the Gentile world. And he's not going to just any Gentile area. He's going to the land of the Canaanites, perhaps the most well-known enemy of Israel. And he's going to meet a Canaanite woman there. This story is also told in the Gospel of Mark, which was written before Matthew's Gospel. And as we've noted when we started looking into Matthew, ancient sources, they point to Mark's Gospel as being written as a collection of stories, a collection of remembrances, while Matthew's Gospel was written a bit more carefully, with careful intent to teach beyond just telling a story of, oh, I remember this happened with Jesus. He has careful intent to teach us theology. And this is why a comparison between the two Gospels can show some differences. These differences include two, where in Mark there's sometimes one. These differences also include Matthew changing some wording in the story of this Canaanite woman. Particular to our story today, Mark uses the more contemporary term of his day, the Syrophoenician woman. And by the way, I should have said this. We have this printed out. If you want to see how the dialogue goes, I printed out the page as the dialogue goes through. And so you'll be able to see what we're going to go through on a page laid out with dialogue. If you want one of those sheets, I don't know if Jeremy, can you hand them? If you want one of those sheets to go through what we're going to look at, you could raise your hand. If not, no worries. But if anybody wants one of those sheets, oh, we got one over here and one over there. So as we're going through the story, Matthew calls her a Canaanite woman, but Mark uses the name a Syrophoenician woman. Matthew's calling her a Canaanite because, remember, Matthew is recreating the First Testament with Jesus as the focus. So Jesus isn't interested as much in the contemporary setting, but he's interested in the setting that relates to the First Testament. And so we have John the Baptist who died, and Jesus said that the voice of the law and the prophets was until John the Baptist. So with John the Baptist's death, Jesus is now the voice. And on the heels of John's death, Jesus, he reenacts and he redefines the Exodus with the feeding of the 5,000. Continuing the issue of faith and uncertainty, Jesus is upon then the stormy waters after the feeding of the 5,000. And it calls back to creation as the Spirit of God is over the stormy waters. And this declares that Jesus is God. And so with this, you can see where the books of the New Testament are being referenced with each passage. So this looks at Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. When he's in the wilderness and he's over the waters, it's Genesis and Exodus. And so with Jesus as God, we find that Jesus is the gateway to the tassel, to the law. And on that note, we see that this issue of the law, tradition, defilement, and Moses, with Jesus as the new voice of the First Testament. We're covering these books out of the Torah. And so we're touching on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. We're looking at the speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy, where Moses he said, food defiles. And Jesus is saying, the heart is what defiles. And so now Jesus is entering the land of Canaan, just as Joshua did in the book of Joshua. And Matthew references the Syrophoenician woman by the ancient term Canaanite. So we're seeing Jesus put as the focus here. And Joshua entered the land of Canaan long ago with an army to slaughter not just the fighting men, but the vulnerable targets of even women and children and babies. But now Jesus enters the land of Canaan with a handful of disciples, and a Canaanite woman comes to him for mercy, for herself and for her child. We're seeing critical books and critical events continue to be referenced by Matthew from the First Testament. And so now, with the book of Joshua being referenced, as Jesus enters the land of Canaan with his people, and he meets a Canaanite, we read in Matthew 15:22. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." And what does Jesus do in 15:23? He doesn't answer her at all. It's in Jesus' silence here that I suggested you might enjoy an exercise with spiritual eyes, to look at this in a new way and consider, why doesn't Jesus respond? And why might he have been silent with the two blind men in the first tassel miracle? And why is he remaining silent now with the Canaanite woman in the second tassel miracle? Is it for the same reason? Is it for different reasons? A common belief is that he begins by being silent. And then he's going to basically almost insult her by calling her a dog or associating her with a dog. And in doing so, he's testing her faith. He's seeing how much she will hang on to him through. This doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sound like Jesus to not talk to someone and then to even insult them by associating them with what in that time would have been a dirty dog. And to see, will they stick with me through the abuse? How great is their faith if I keep hitting at them? In the birth of the Reformed school of thought, this idea did catch on, and it does hold to this day. But there's other ideas out there, and I want to offer you a redemptive reading that lifts the woman up and educates the disciples. And it sticks to the character of Jesus. Part of what we have to carry into this reading, it comes from our realization of the complexity with which Jesus speaks. He's not a one-dimensional character. He's someone with emotions. He can speak with sarcasm. He can speak with humor. He's a human being. He speaks in so many different ways. And so we've seen what we've called contradicting contradictions when he says, if you come to me with nothing, I'm going to take it away. In other words, if you come with nothing, he'll give you something. He's taking away your nothingness. We've seen facetious comments about, oh, the disciples are so great. Yes, you guys are awesome. You guys are star students. I'm kidding. Here's a parable. You guys need to learn from the ground up. Jesus is a real person who employs real language. And Matthew's a skilled writer who brings the challenge of an excellent rabbi to his disciples. He brings that challenge to us to wrestle and to grow in wisdom. So here's what we have. The woman requests mercy. And in the Greek, it says that Jesus didn't say a word, logos. He didn't say a word. What does Jesus' silence invite this time that wasn't present last time? It invites his disciples to step in and say something. It gives room for his students who are with him to figure out what they'll say. And they say something. What do they say? Jesus, send her away. She is annoying us. It's on the disciples' words that Jesus is going to give an answer. The question is, who is he answering? Logically, in the course of things, I believe he's answering the disciples' complaint. What is it that we just came from in the context of this event that is happening right now with the Canaanite woman? Our words defile us. Our words speak out of our heart. That is the source of defilement. And so from the heart comes the things that fracture community. From our heart comes the things that seek to divide humanity. The disciples could have said all kinds of other stuff here. If they were really annoyed with this woman, they could have at least called for some charity. They could have said, Jesus, would you just heal her daughter so she can leave? They could have asked for something good to be done for her to then get her out of there so they're not annoyed. They could have even sought to assist her petition for mercy. They could have been empathetic and said, Jesus, look at this poor woman who's embarrassing herself for the sake of her daughter. Look at how much she loves her daughter. I know she's a Canaanite, but would you heal her? Would you heal her daughter? But they assume that Jesus isn't there for her. They assume that Jesus isn't going to help her. They assume that she's not even on Jesus' radar right now. They might be grasping that, they might be struggling to grasp right now, but getting a little bit, that Gentiles are on the mission of Jesus. But it appears right now that they can't fathom that Gentile inclusion would also count in that inclusion Canaanites, Israel's sworn enemy. So Jesus answers the disciples by vocalizing the thoughts in their head, just like he did a while ago when they wanted him to believe that they were really good. And they were like, I hope Jesus thinks we're really good. And then Jesus begins, oh, you guys are amazing. And then he redirects them. Jesus now answers the disciples with the inner thoughts of their heart. So the disciples say, Jesus, send her away. She's so annoying. And Jesus responds, of course I will, because obviously I was only sent to the lost sheep of the family of Israel. Obviously I was only sent to the house of Israel. The word house means family. And the passage says house because I believe the word house here is going to be important in a moment. But I believe, just like last time, Jesus, he's calling out the thoughts of his disciples. Send her away, she's annoying. Oh, of course, I'll take care of that for you right away. Within Jesus' reply that he's only been sent to the lost sheep of Israel is a subversive comment that he's saying, so if you think I've been sent to you, you are lost sheep. The passage here shows that when you talk like this, you're proving yourself to still be lost sheep. While this woman is actually more in than even you are. She's identified me more than you ever have. Okay, so Jesus starts off by saying, of course we'll send her away. I'm here to serve your needs, and Obviously, I only came for those who are in the house of Israel, the lost ones. As Jesus replies to his disciples and he speaks out their thoughts, the woman comes up to seek Jesus's immediate attention. So now she comes up to Jesus and all pretense is gone. And she just falls on her knees and all she has to say is, "Lord, help me." That's it. And you can feel Matthew's writing here. You can see the desperation. And at this point, the disciples could jump in now after Jesus' first comment, and they could have gone like, you're right. You weren't sent only for our house. And okay, we're showing ourselves to be the lost sheep. So we correct our language. And our hearts are really breaking for her now as she is in the dirt, groveling. But the disciples don't step in. So Jesus continues. As she begs for help, Jesus answers, again, not necessarily for her sake. Jesus answers, it's not fair to take the children's food. It's not fair to take their food, the disciples, and throw it to the dogs. Jesus has now put what this woman is asking for into the hands of the disciples. It's pictured as food that has been given to them. So now they're faced with what Jesus is saying is, I've given them the food, which now puts them in control. They could interrupt now and say, oh, well, we'll certainly share. We'll share. If you're saying you've given it to us and we now own this, we'll share. The disciples could be like their ancestor Abraham, who petitioned God on behalf of others. They could be like Moses, who was understood to petition God on behalf of the unrighteous, knowing now that they are in control of this thing. They could have done this, but they don't make the choice. But Jesus has shifted something with his second comment. The word here, dog, is the Greek word for even a household dog or a small dog. It's not the word for just any street dog. These are dogs that would have been in the household and they would have been appreciated and loved by the family. Whether they're catching mice or helping out around the house, whatever they're doing, they would have been loved by the family and they would have been in the house. So first, Jesus had drawn this woman as distinct from the house of Israel. And he voiced the thoughts of his disciples. Oh, I'm not there for her. I'm obviously here for your house. But now he has drawn into the same household both of them. He has shifted her from outside to in and offered control to the disciples. They are, at the moment, the children being fed. And they could choose to say, when Jesus says, I've served the kids their food and it's not fair for me to take it back. They could say, oh, she's in our house. Like she's a little dog, but she's in our house. Take some of our food and give it to her. The disciples have been given the power of mercy. And now this Canaanite woman has gone from outside the house to in the house. The disciples still don't interrupt. I imagine they're reeling as Jesus is hijacking their selfishness, that they wanted to keep Jesus to themselves, and Jesus is attacking their lowly view of the Canaanite woman. And he has now drawn her from outside to inside. And that right there is a huge paradigm shift for them. While the disciples are reeling, this woman is not insulted. I like to believe that she's kind of over here. One academic put this in my head. She's over here and the disciples are kind of over here. And as she has come up to Jesus, he's kind of giving her a wink every once in a while. Like, I'm using you to teach them. And so this woman doesn't show that she's insulted. What happens is she actually sees the opening that Jesus has just given her, and she plays off of him. She grabs onto the metaphor of being the second lowest to eat a meal. You have the metaphor of the second lowest, which is the children. And then you have the lowest, which is the dogs, who get the crumbs while everybody else eats. And so she says, yes, it's not fair to take their food, but the dogs have their own portion. It's the crumbs that fall during mealtime. And so the dogs get to eat at the same time everyone else is eating. We have a portion, it's the crumbs. Essentially, this woman, what she does is she leaves arguing about status. She leaves the argument of status for a different time. This woman, not arguing over status, is contrasted to the disciples' continual fighting and scratching and struggling for status. This woman expresses a humility. Okay, well, we're all in the same house. Cool, let's just work with that. This woman doesn't fight over who is the greatest in the kingdom. Who's going to sit on your left and right? Who gets this position and that position? She simply says, you've drawn us all in. Here's the food that's available. She's just happy to be in. You're going to hear the kids come back in a second as we wrap up. Jesus responds, and now it is clear that he is responding to her. It says, Jesus answered, and then it says, Jesus answered her. He says, woman, your faith is great. Your faith is incredible. Let your daughter be healed. Jesus has known all along that this woman's faith was great. But Jesus has taken this woman of great faith and he has invited her into a discourse so that she becomes a co-teacher with Jesus to teach the disciples. This woman is a Canaanite woman who was pulled in to disciple the disciples on the inclusion of God. And this woman is moved before the disciples' eyes in this engagement from outside to inside and then to great, to even greater faith than what the disciples are having right now. At the end, this woman teaches a lesson to the disciples who are always concerned about status. She teaches them that the humble don't fight for status. The humble simply seek the loving mercy of God. Jesus will show this in his own prayer. This woman is modeling what Jesus will do in the garden when he comes to God. And Jesus doesn't hold his status. He doesn't argue over status. He simply says, your will be done. From this lesson, Jesus will go onto a mountain in the Gentile region and the disciples will watch as he heals Gentiles. The Jews have had their mountain experience with Jesus with the Sermon on the Mount, and now the Gentiles will get their mountain experience. In the divisions that we face today in so many areas of life, and claims of who is right and who is out, I love that it weighed on Nate's heart when he opened us with prayer about our divisions today, because that's where this brought me. He didn't even know what I was going to say. On the divisions that we face of claiming they're right and they're out. This Canaanite woman lives out an anti us versus them faith. She isn't here to argue about status. As soon as she hears we're just simply all in, she simply says, great, now give me something, please. And she simply rests on Jesus having everybody in. But in what this Canaanite woman does, she shows that she's right now the one actually eating at the table, and the disciples are scrambling for crumbs right now. The disciples are the little dogs who are catching what little tidbits they can while she has the full meal deal.